So today I'm going to do radio transients, and I will start with something very basic, and the basic is this electromagnetic spectrum. And we all know that traditionally astronomy was done in optical bands, and probably the simplest reason was that our eyes were sensitive to optical bands. But to get the more complete information, it is why not exploit all other wavelengths of the electromagnetic signal. And so one can start from radio band up to the gamma rays. However, X-ray, gamma, ultraviolet, they're all absorbed by our atmosphere. So it is only radio astronomy and optical astronomy which one can do from Earth. And as you know, the emphasis for this winter school is on radio astronomy. But when I said complementary information and more complete information, what do I mean? And I want to start with this diagram. And this is signal image. This is an image in optical band, and it does look good, but there's nothing too much exciting about it. But if you see the same object in X-ray and optical band, you see a very different structure. That's because the light in optical, light in X-ray, and light in radio are coming from very different kind of physics mechanisms. So that's why it is only when one takes information in all possible wavelengths available to us is that one can start to make a much more complete start to get a more complete understanding of a system. And this becomes extremely crucial in astronomy because all we have available for us are photons in most of the cases until very recently. So you want to collect these photons in as many energy bands as possible. And radio has a very special place. One, we can do radio astronomy at lower cost because you can do from ground. Second, they do give us a lot of important information. And I want to show this particular galaxy. They are on the same scales, spatial scales. But on the left side, you see it in optical band. On the right side, you see in radio band. In optical, the galaxy look very small, but when you start to see it in radio, and this radio emission is coming from 21 centimeter neutral hydrogen, which you must have studied in heard maybe from Nissim or someone else. This emission is much more spread out, and that tells you that the galaxy scales are much larger than one can see in the optical band. So that's what my aim is, that we do get very complementary and useful information in radio band, and transients are no different. So let's come to the transient sources. Contrary to most of the other astronomical sources like galaxies, stars we are seeing, these transient sources are the sources which vary on human time scales. When I'm talking of human time scales, I'm actually talking of variability in say few years to few months to few days to few seconds to even few milliseconds. So anything which we can see with our eyes changing, we typically call it a transient phenomena. And I would like to say that currently, uh, traditionally, transient astronomy was not the prime focus of radio astronomy, but nowadays, exploration of transient universe is coming out as a very fast emerging area within radio astronomy for the following reasons. One is that in radio band, transient sources are dominated by two kind of emission mechanisms. So one sees these rather slow varying transients. For example, when I am saying slow varying, I'm talking of seconds to minutes to more like say months or so. But I'm not talking of milliseconds. These slow transients, they are the radio emission from these transients are emitted due to the synchrotron emission, and synchrotron emission is produced by in the presence by relativistic electrons in the presence of magnetic field. It means these electrons are already having they are having very high energy. In fact, to produce radio emission, the electrons have to reach to around GeV energies. Now, if you remember that the rest mass of an electron is 511 kilo electron volt, you can imagine that how much you have to push the electron energy to GeV range, how much to be able to give radio emission. The second type of transients in radio band are coherent emission dominated transients, and these have extremely fast variability uh, of the order of milliseconds, and some of these are giant flares, pulses from pulsars, rapid rotating stars, fast radio bursts, and so on. Generally, the way radio astronomy works, the slow transients or the synchrotron dominated transients are mostly searched in the image domain, whereas these coherent dominated transients are searched in the time domain observations. And there's another important aspect of short transients is that since they undergo dispersion, scattering, and Faraday rotation, they become a very powerful probe to understand the intergalactic medium if they are extragalactic sources, interstellar medium. So one can get information about the intervening media because if one studies these transients in radio band. Now, this is a transient phase space. This is slightly older diagram, but it has one has a more recent diagram also. Now here you see a blue shaded region and the white region, and there is a diagonal line, and this diagonal line makes the divides the boundary from coherent transients to incoherent transients. And how does one that do that is here on the basis of say brightness temperature. Brightness temperature, we can do some small calculation and see that if as long as the brightness temperature is less than 10 to the power 12 Kelvin, then the transient is going to be incoherent transient. And what is brightness temperature? Suppose your source was, consider that your source was a black body, and then what kind of temperature it should have had to get that kind of emission, that you can associate in your mind, intuitively think of as a brightness temperature. But the coherent transient sources have extremely high brightness temperature. They can reach of the order of, in some cases, 10 to the power 30 or 10 to the power up to 40 Kelvin also. So anything which has brightness temperature higher than 10 to the power 12 Kelvin is considered as coherent sources, and whereas the lower than that temperature are considered incoherent emission. Now, why is this extremely important, and why one is very actually what one gets especially out of radio band is transient, as I said, that the synchrotron emission is coming from relativistic electrons in the presence of magnetic field. You can bring electrons to such high energies only in the extreme cases of physics. For example, these things are happening in supersonic shocks and explosion sites. And so transient phenomena do represent extremes of physics which is not available for one to study in the labs. They represent extremes of gravity, velocity, temperature, density, pressure. Coherent emission most of the time are connected with extremely high magnetic field, so they become, one can, so they are in some way representing extremes of magnetic field. So they become a probe to study physics in extreme conditions, which is not available for one to do in the lab settings. Historically, I already have mentioned that transient astronomy was mostly done as an optical band astronomy, and radio transients were mostly uh, limited to doing the follow-up observation of transients found in the optical band. And that was because the field of view was small and it was very time consuming, and our telescopes were not that sensitive. But in the current era, one is having a very large bandwidth sensitivity and high resolution and fast survey speeds. So because of lot of new technology in implemented in radio telescopes, It is a new era where transients are also starting to being probed in radio bands. In fact, there are some transients, they are bright only in radio bands and one cannot study them in any other bands. So that becomes a very important factor too. So there are some transients, and I will not talk about all, but I will just give a very quick update on what kind of transients we see. We see transients as close to us as in our solar system. We see a lot of solar radio bursts, which are coherent as well as incoherent emission, and MWA and LOFA telescopes, which are low frequency radio telescopes, are doing really exemplary observations in understanding these solar radio bursts. And there is one group in NCRA itself who are doing a lot of research on solar bursts with using MWA. Then one has these radio bursts from Jupiter, which are coming due to the magnetic activity at the surface, and they have milliseconds to minute scale. And one also sees the electron cyclotron coherent kind of emission. So these are mostly the burst one is seeing from our solar system. Then there are many kinds of radio transients in our galaxy itself. One sees, say, if you have very low mass stars like M12 stars, and so one see these stellar radio bursts from these kind of stars, and then even some giant stars are showing magnetic activities, cataclysmic variables which are occurring in stars. These are showing some activities. We have measured many of these things. Now, there's another new class of objects which are called magnetic massive stars. 10% of our galactic stars are magnetic, and some of these stars have shown to have electron cyclotron coherent emission radio, and which is seen only in the radio bands. And this is a new emerging area of massive star evolution, and there is a lot of interesting work is being done at GMRT in this field, and GMRT has really showed some really interesting aspects. For example, there are right now only seven candidates, seven such stars in our galaxy, and two candidates, and out of those, five have been discovered with GMRT in 600 megahertz band. Then, of course, one has X-ray binary, which involves either a neutron star or a stellar mass black hole, which is accreting matter from companion star and giving rise to these transient bursts. And of course, the magnetar bursts from, as well as the giant radio pulses from some pulsars. Now one can go to the extragalactic transients, and extragalactic transients one generally sees from supernovae, gamma ray bursts, electromagnetic counterparts of gravitational bursts. These are all explosive events, which means the events after that, the progenitor of the event is no longer, I don't know how to say, alive. The events are, you can't see repeat these events. Then there are some accretion events, which are tidal disruption events, where a star is eaten by a black hole, and AGN activities due to the black hole accretion. And there is a newer class which is fast radio bursts. And initially it was thought they are explosive events, but in some cases, around 10% of the cases, we have seen them to be repeating. So we know that they may be explosive event in some cases, but not in all cases. In this talk, I am going to focus mostly on explosive transient events, and because one of the reasons is that this is a very most of the explosive transient events can be explained by the end stages of massive stars, and so they are very natural points of stellar evolution of some of the massive stars. So I will start with that, and I will start with a star like our sun. And we all by now know that in our sun, the energy is produced by hydrogen burning into helium. And the radiation pressure produced due to this fusion reaction is the one which is keeping sun stable and also giving us energy. And eventually, when hydrogen is exhausted, sun will become a red giant and eventually end its life in as a white dwarf, which will be a fraction of sun's mass, around 0.1, 0.2 solar mass, and around size of Earth. So it's going to be a very compact object, white dwarf, which will be supported by electron degeneracy pressure. However, this is not the life cycle for more massive stars. If you take more massive stars, which are more than 8 solar masses or so, in those stars, the conditions are more favorable even for heavier elements fusion. So it's not just hydrogen fusing into helium. One also sees helium fusion reactions, carbon oxygen fusion reactions, silicon fusion reactions, and so on. So in these stars, in fact, as per our current understanding, all the heavier elements, helium and maybe a little bit of lithium, are made inside these massive stars, and these stars, when they explode and end their life as one of these explosive transients, it is at that stage when these heavier elements are made available to us by scattering in the interstellar medium. So what happens in massive stars? In these stars, they have a very short life. They will they will undergo these chain of nuclear reactions, as I'm showing you in this plot. They undergo a nuclear fusion reactions up to the iron stage, and once there are no more fusion reactions happening, the star will contract under its own gravity, and then eventually it will end its life either as a supernova explosion or as a gamma ray burst. And at the core of this star, there will be a remnant which will be either a neutron star or a black hole. This is a very simple understanding of supernova and gamma ray bursts. Of course, there are a lot of complications, but I'm really not going to get into that right now. But this is a very simple idea of supernovae and gamma ray bursts. So let's start with supernovae. As per our current understanding, any star which is in the mass range of around 8 to 30 solar masses will end its life as a supernova and leave a neutron star behind. And these neutron stars are of the order of mass of sun, and they will be supported by neutron degeneracy pressure, and their size will be only of the order of a city, around 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers or so. And these supernova explosions, even though they are very rare because only massive stars can do these explosions, yet every second in our universe, around 4 to 8 such supernova explosions are taking place. And when one such supernova explosion happens, it shines brighter than its host galaxy. Host galaxy, for example, Milky Way consists of around 100 billion stars, but one supernova explosion will outshine the light from all these stars for those few moments when the explosion is happening. The total energy release is huge. It is around 10 to the power 53 ergs, but 99% of this energy goes in neutrinos, and only 1%, which is around 10 to the power 51 ergs, or you can imagine in terms of MKS units, it will be 10 to the power 44 joules energy comes out as photons in the electromagnetic band. And I have already mentioned that these are the ones which provide the raw ingredient, these heavier elements in the universe during this explosion. So this is a very simple story of supernovae, but there is another different kind of supernovae. Now, I was talking about sun, which will end its life as white dwarf. Then I was talking about stars more massive than 8 solar masses, which will end their lives as either neutron stars or black holes. But what happens in between? If a star mass is between, say, around 4 to 8 solar masses, it will make a white dwarf, but in the simplest of the theory, this white dwarf is going to be a carbon oxygen white dwarf, because the nuclear fusion reactions proceed up to the making of carbon oxygen. And this white dwarf, if it finds itself a companion, then in the presence of a companion, it will accrete mass, and when it reaches a Chandrasekhar mass limit, it cannot stay stable and it will explode. And this kind of supernova explosion will not leave anything behind. In fact, this animation has this little error where they show a small dot left behind. But in thermonuclear supernova, there is no neutron star or black hole at its core. The whole star is completely disrupted, and the energy comes out, which is roughly same as the other kind of supernova where the gravitation collapse is happening. But these supernovae are called standard candles in our universe, and for a very good reason. And the reason is that since this Chandrasekhar mass limit is so precise for white dwarf, and it depends upon the metallicity, but other than that, it's a very robust limit. So the energy which gets emitted in these explosions is quite precise, and it can be one can then use them as cosmological standard candles. And it is these supernovae, these thermonuclear supernovae, which revealed to us that our universe is not only expanding but accelerating as well. And last decade, the Nobel Prize was given for this discovery to Brand Schmidt and Sal Rappaport. So these supernovae have a very important place, but there are a lot of things which we do not understand in the supernovae. For example, right now it is not clear whether the companion star is going to be a compact star like this white dwarf, or it is going to be a big star like our main sequence star like Sun, or heavier than that. And uh, this is still an open question, and people claim both ways, and there is a possibility that both kind of scenarios are possible. And radio observations provide one of the very important and most constraining aspects of these two models. For example, if it is the top model, then one will have one expects higher radio emission from these kind of supernovae, whereas if it is the lower one, the two compact objects coming together and creating this thermonuclear supernova, one does not expect to have radio emission. And I will tell you a little bit in detail in a few minutes. But this is how it is important. Radio observations are important to understand these supernovae. The supernova discoveries are even now dominated by searches in optical bands. Of course, there are some disadvantages because optical bands are more susceptible to dust and extinction. So we do miss out a lot of supernovae. And we are hoping that with the future radio telescopes, we can start these searches in radio band itself. But currently, that these what I'm writing here, these are some of the few facilities whose aim is to search for transients and mainly supernovae. And these are basically robotic telescopes which are scanning the sky at a given interval every say few days or so. And for example, in this image, you can see this image on the left was taken on 28th May 2009, and on the right it was taken on 17th July 2009. And at the arrow, you see a new source appearing, which is not there on the left. So somewhere between 28th May and 17th July, a supernova exploded in this galaxy. And by doing these kind of searches, one can estimate, and if the searches are say more frequent, then one can have precise information about exactly when the supernova exploded, and that gives a lot of information. And in this very interesting animation, which I got from ESO, I am going to show you the supernovae discovery since 1900, and you see right now it's up to 1946. And initially, there were very few supernovae discovered because we didn't have access to those great technologies and to have these robotic surveys. But now, in the current times, we are discovering close to 1,000 or more supernovae every year. So the supernovae discoveries have suddenly increased in past decade or so, and we are discovering many more such supernovae. So many more supernovae are available for us to do science and understand these exotic stellar explosions. Why radio frequencies become important to study these transients? One is that the supernovae will be exploding from stars which are going to make all these heavy elements at their core. But because of the radiation pressure due to these nuclear fusion reactions, the outermost gravitational layers of stars are not that tightly bound to the star, and the star is, ends up losing its outermost layers, and in some cases the whole of hydrogen shell, which I'm writing here as type 1b, is lost in some cases. Not just hydrogen shell, but even helium shell are lost. So the progenitor, the star which explodes as supernova, at the time of explosion may have been looking very different properties, and we do not currently understand how, which kind of progenitor is exploding as which kind of supernova. That mapping is not yet clear. One can study the supernovae in, I would say, optical bands, but optical bands are optical light is dominated by the radioactive decay in these supernovae, and that does not give very good information about the progenitor. At the same time, other way to do it is to look at, for example, run these computer simulations. But these simulations are extremely expensive simulations. In fact, initially, last decade or so, it was taking few years to run just one simulation. And towards the very end stages of the star, it becomes a very fine-tuned function of lot of complicated physics, including neutrino physics, the magneto-hydrodynamical theory, general relativity, and every kind of physics you can imagine does come into picture. It becomes really overwhelming, and these things are not very robust as of now. But radio bands provide that unique input or to understand these progenitor systems and map different kind of progenitors to their supernovae for the following reason. The supernova, I just now showed this diagram, that supernova before explosion is losing its mass from outermost layer, and sometimes the mass is lost at a very high speed and at a very high rate. For example, in our sun, the mass loss is happening only 10 to the power minus 14 solar masses every year. But these kind of stars can lose mass anywhere from 10 to the power minus 5 solar mass per year to 10 to the power minus 3 or minus 2 solar masses per year. Now, this mass loss will form as wind around the star, this gray shaded circle. These winds are moving with the speeds of the order of, say, 10 kilometer per second or 100 kilometer per second. Now, when the supernova explodes, this ejecta of the explosion is moving with the speeds of 10,000 to 100,000 kilometer per second. And when this ejecta is moving through this wind, it is tracing back the history of the progenitor, because these winds carry the footprints of the progenitor star, how the star was losing mass and how the nuclear fusion reactions must be taking place, that the radiation pressure must have been so much to lose this much of mass, and so on. And not that's just one aspect of it, but the fact that the ejecta speeds are hundreds to thousands times larger than the speeds of the wind. If one observes a supernova in radio band, say for 1 year, one can trace back the history of the progenitor before explosion for, say, 1,000 years. Or if you do observation for 10 years, you can trace back for 10,000 years. You can reach up to the carbon burning stage or even earlier stages or so. So this is in some way, I call it time machine, and by studying this circumstellar interaction, one can understand the progenitor stars, and these circumstellar interactions show themselves mainly in radio and X-ray band. X-ray band, because these shocks are extremely hot, they have temperature of the order of millions to hundreds of millions Kelvin. So they show as thermal X-rays. At the same time, these shocks are moving with supersonic speeds, very high speeds, and the Fermi diffusive acceleration is taking place in these shocks, and the electrons are reaching to relativistic speeds. And these electrons, in the presence of the magnetic field which is present in the medium, are giving rise to synchrotron emission, which is coming in radio band. So if one studies the supernovae in radio band, this circumstellar interaction, one can get some unprecedented information about the progenitor systems of these supernovae. And there are some things which can only be explored through radio observations. For example, uh, the synchrotron emitting region, whether it is a homogeneous or inhomogeneous region, how much magnetic field is there. For example, the magnetic field is not just going to be the interstellar media magnetic field. There are a lot of instabilities happening at the supernova shock front and the circumstellar wind front, which is called contact discontinuity, and magnetic field will be amplified here, and radio observations can give some information about that. The mass loss rate, whether it is a homogeneous mass loss rate or whether it is explosive mass loss rate, all these informations are hidden in radio band. Whether of course, the how much diffusive Fermi acceleration, the electron acceleration fraction. So these observations are, these kind of physics is best probed in radio bands, and in NCRA, GMRT is really contributing a lot in understanding these supernovae. And this is just one example where, I'm showing the fits of the spectra and light curve of the supernovae to understand the models of the progenitor. I'm not going to get into the details of these results, but if you are interested, I can discuss with you later. Now I'm moving on to the gamma ray burst. And as per our current understanding, in the very, very simple model, if a star has mass more than 30 solar masses, that star, when it ends its life, it will explode as a gamma ray burst and it will make a black hole at the center. Now, this explosion speeds are of the order of 90 to 99% of the speed of light. And because of these relativistic speeds, there will be a collimation which will be 1 over Lorentz factor, and Lorentz factor in these cases are of the orders of thousands. So which means these gamma ray bursts are extremely collimated events. That also means that you can, if an event is collimated, you can see only those events which are pointing towards you, which are pointing towards Earth. So it means if we see one gamma ray burst, we must be missing out around 500 gamma ray bursts. But currently, we are detecting around 1 to 2 gamma ray bursts every day, thanks to the some dedicated telescopes whose only job is to just search for these gamma ray bursts. But these gamma ray bursts, they have some properties. They last only for a few seconds. For example, on the right, this animation I'm showing you a light curve of gamma ray burst, time in seconds and counts per seconds. You can see this burst is lasting only for, in this case, around 10 seconds. But in those few seconds, when the burst happens, gamma ray burst happens, it outshines the whole of the universe in gamma ray bands. In this animation, you can see the universe in gamma ray energies, and then this one gamma ray burst, which is explosion of a massive star, is outshining the whole of the universe in gamma ray bands. And the energy is roughly same as that those of supernovae, but we see them much more brighter because all of this energy is collimated in a very small jet-like event. It is not isotropically distributed in a whole sphere. So that's why the energy experience is much more, but actual energy from the events are roughly of the same order of those of supernovae. The properties of gamma ray bursts, every single gamma ray burst has a unique, I call it thumbprint, because their light curves are very, very different. But people, as per current understanding, they think there are two kinds of gamma ray bursts. One are the long gamma ray bursts, which have time scales of more than 2 seconds. Then other are short gamma ray bursts, which are of the order of milliseconds to less than 2 seconds. And again, with the current theoretical understanding, the long gamma ray bursts are coming from, as I said, this explosion of very massive stars. But the second kind of gamma ray bursts are slightly analogous to those thermonuclear supernovae, which I just now talked about. But this second kind of gamma ray bursts are coming due to the merger of either two neutron stars or one neutron star and one black hole, which means a neutron star, when it comes in the vicinity of another companion, which is either a neutron star or a black hole, then they will merge together and give rise to a short gamma ray burst. And let me tell you that this was a theoretical idea, and there was circumstantial evidence for a while, but it is only just 3 years ago that we have this confirmation that at least in some cases, when the two neutron stars will merge, they will give rise to a short gamma ray burst. And I will tell you about that in a short while. Now, gamma ray burst discoveries, they were actually really very difficult to discover. And first gamma ray bursts were discovered in around late 1960s. And for 30 years, the field was stagnant because people had no idea what these bursts are, because they were lasting only for a few seconds and they were in gamma ray bands, and gamma rays are hard to focus. So one did not know exactly where in the sky they exploded. The precision was bad. So it took 30 years for people to able to see the low frequency counterparts of these gamma ray bursts, to be able to understand and decipher some physics out of these. And that happened once BeppoSax, the number two here, was launched in 90s. So in 1997, for the first time, an X-ray emission was seen from a gamma ray burst after the burst was over in a few seconds or so. And then later, radio telescope also discovered the radio emission from this gamma ray burst at a later time. And this emission was not coming because of the explosion. This emission was coming, I will tell you in detail, but this emission was coming from this explosion interacting with the surrounding media, this explosive ejecta. But currently, there are few telescopes which are completely dedicated to gamma ray burst discoveries. One is Swift telescope. This Neil Gehrels Swift telescope is a telescope which is revolving around the sky, and it has three instruments. It has a Swift BAT, which is the burst alert transient detector, which works in energies from 15 keV to 350 keV. Then it has an X-ray telescope on board, which is from zero point 0.2 to 10 keV range. And then it also has an ultraviolet telescope on board. So once a BAT, which is a burst alert transient, triggers a burst, it sees a burst, robotically the X-ray telescope and the ultraviolet telescope on board starts to look at in that direction of the sky, and hence without wasting any time, one can get a lot of information about individual gamma ray bursts. And once the position is there, one, even the optical and radio people from ground can start to observe these bursts. And this is how the GRB science is happening. And on the top there is sorry, this before below Swift there is Fermi. Fermi is also a sky. It's a mm, it's a telescope rotating around the Earth and looking for gamma ray bursts, but it works in very high energies, in GeV range and higher energy ranges, and it is discovering the gamma ray bursts which are exploding in very, very high energies. In India, we have AstroSat, which was launched a few years ago, and AstroSat has 5 instruments on board, and it is looking at gamma ray bursts. It is the first telescope which has a polarization capabilities in hard X-rays. So it is also looking at the polarization of some of these gamma ray bursts and contributing a lot towards our understanding. This is just a pretty plot which Swift put out. These are the actual GRB locations, color coded year wise, but now we have more than 3,000 gamma ray bursts detected uh, just by this Swift telescope. So this one telescope has contributed much more in GRB science than all other telescopes combined. The afterglows of the gamma ray bursts are the ones which give much more detailed information about the system, and in the following way. Some of the physics is in fact similar. When these ejecta, which is a now collimated ejecta, when it interacts or it moves in the medium, it will again have very favorable condition for synchrotron emission to happen. But the fact that this ejecta is moving with very, very high speed, the synchrotron emission will not just be in radio band but in higher energy bands also. And here I am showing you the 3D plot of a synchrotron emission. And the property of the synchrotron emission is that as you keep on observing it later and later time, it will peak at lower and lower frequencies, and which are a favorable frequency band in radio bands. So basically, radio, even though gamma ray bursts last only for a few seconds, their afterglow in X-rays last only for a few days, and optical maybe a month or so. In radio bands, one can study gamma ray bursts for several months up to a few years. In fact, recently we studied a gamma ray burst with GMRT, and we published data for more than 1,000 days, that is 3 years, and we could get unprecedented information about the environments of the gamma ray burst, because these environments of the burst, which is what radio emission is tracing. And radio emission is also tracing the energetics and geometry of the burst. And that is because of the following reason. Radio will come out last and they will last longer. And as jet is slowing down with time, at some point the jet will become quasi-spherical because of the lower Lorentz factor, and then it will become independent of geometry. Now, at that point, if you find out the energy of the burst from radio observations, that allows us to understand the energetics of the burst. Otherwise, the problem is that if you're studying, say, in X-ray band, you don't know how much of the opening is there, how collimated the jet is. So you may be seeing some flux, but to convert into energy in supernova, it is easy. You just do a 4 pi r square. But here, you don't know that factor. It is not 4 pi. It is collimated. The collimation could be a few degrees, few tens of degrees, and we don't know that. And the late time radio observations help tremendously in that aspect. Now, this is one of the GRB which I am showing you here. This GRB happened in 2017. And on the left side, you can see the spectra starting from day 4 to the last one is day 900, which means, and on the right, the plot is light curve from millimeter bands up to the GMRT 400 megahertz band. In fact, this happens to be the first GRB in the history of GRBs to be detected at as low as 400 megahertz band. But one can see that you see this light curve evolution at so many frequencies that one can not only understand and estimate the density of the medium, but also the evolution of the density, that how mass loss was happening, whether it was a smooth event or whether it was a sketchy event, fuzzy event, or whether it was an explosive mass loss or whatever. So radio observations are really critical in that aspect. Now I'm going to merger of compact objects, and I call it a second death. And I gave you some hints about this when I said that short gamma ray bursts may come from merger of two stars, two compact objects, which are two neutron stars or one neutron star or one black hole. And on the left, I am here showing you a merger of two black holes. On the right, I'm showing you merger of two neutron stars. Since black holes and neutron stars themselves are the remnants of stellar death, or the first death, I call it the second death, when the remnants of the first death, they come together and then they merge again, and they will make black hole in this case. But in the left case, since these are two black holes coming together, one will not be able to see them because they won't produce any light, any electromagnetic radiation, whereas the neutron star merger will give rise to some light. So how do we know that these black hole mergers are happening in our universe? We didn't know. We didn't know till 2015, when for the first time which is advanced LIGO, this is Advanced Laser Interferometric Gravitational Wave Observatory, discovered the gravitational waves for the first time. And they figured that these gravitational waves were coming from the merger of two black holes which were around 30 solar masses each. And then these black holes merged, they gave rise to this gravitational wave which traveled through Earth, and In advanced LIGO, which are two perpendicular arms of 4 kilometers, one of the arm was squeezed by 1,000th of the width of a proton. So that the precision they measured these signals of gravitational wave. On the right side, the merger of two neutron stars, that was also a theoretical concept until 17th August 2017, where for the first time gravitational waves were discovered by advanced LIGO and Virgo, which is in Italy, from the merger of two neutron stars. And this event is really a watershed event, probably the event of this century or maybe decade. In this case, for the first time, one saw gravitational waves. Later, within 1.7 seconds, the gamma ray bursts were seen, or gamma rays were seen from Fermi as well as integral telescopes. Then later, within 10 hours, optical emission was seen, and it turned out that this burst happened in an NGC, in a galaxy called NGC 4993, which is only 40 megaparsecs away from us. And later, near infrared and ultraviolet observations were done. There were a lot of efforts to search for radio and X-ray emission, but they were not seen until day 9 and day 16 respectively, when on day 9 X-ray emission was seen and on day 16 radio emission was seen. And this was very useful because by that time the source was close to sun and optical observations could not take place, and this was only radio and X-ray observations which could give us some information about what is going on in the system. So more than 3,000 astronomers looked at this event with all the telescopes possible in the world, and the paper, several hundreds paper came out. One of the major paper which came out had around 4,000 astronomers, including several of us from IUCO and NCRA. And this paper currently remains the paper with largest number of authors in a single paper. This is how interesting this event was. And on the left, I'm showing you a different kind of emission component. One of the component is what is called kilonova, which is coming out due to the radioactive decay of neutron-rich material. Then there is also a jet, the explosion, which since this is two neutron star merging together, they're expected to give rise to a short gamma ray burst, which should be a collimated emission. It is showing that, and it is also showing the emission due to the interaction of these components with the surrounding medium. So this was the first of many. For example, this was the first binary neutron star merger seen which showed gravitational waves. This was the first gravitational wave even which shows light. This also allowed us to measure Hubble constant without involving the modeling of supernovae or Planck. This was the first confirmed association that two neutron stars merge together and they will make SGRB, short gamma ray burst. And this was the first confirmed discovery of kilonova, and it told us that synthesis of very heavy elements like gold and platinum are synthesized in these neutron star merger sites. So this was first of many, and it was like really electromagnetic gravitational wave bonanza. And this was the first time, it truly a start of multi-messenger astronomy. So far, we could only see light. It means you could only look at the objects which are emitting light. What does that mean? That you can't probe very inside of stars because we can't see anything which is happening inside the sun. We can only see what is happening at the surface because light comes from surface. So anything which is not emitting light, one could not see with the electromagnetic counterpart. But gravitational waves provided us another messenger to understand the universe in its deep dark depths which are not emitting any light. And so this was another way to understand the universe, and this was really very important discovery. Radio was very critical, and we have followed this event. We are a very large group of some more than 200 astronomers all over the world, and we are working with GMRT, very large array in USA, and ATCA in Australia, MeerKAT in South Africa. And this event was followed in all the wave bands, and it, in fact, radio observations were the one which told us that these neutron star mergers will indeed give rise to short gamma ray bursts. That was because the initial observations with optical and X-ray and gamma rays, they did not support the idea of just a short gamma ray burst. The data were more in tune with not just the jet, but the burst of gamma rays which is coming when this there is a shock breakout happening at the surface of this star. Now it was the very large baseline measurement, very high resolution radio observations, which are called VLBI at micro arcsecond resolution, and the radio light curve modeling, which told us that the jet actually came out of this merger system, which was moving with the speed of around 98% of the speed of light. And hence, at least in some cases, two neutron star mergers will provide us the short gamma ray burst. Now, the last part I want to touch is fast radio bursts. Fast radio bursts are very new science. These are the real locations of fast radio bursts, what you are seeing here in this animation. And they were first discovered from Park's archival data, and they were reported in 2007. And people still did not believe that they really exist until in 2013 four more fast radio bursts were seen. They are millisecond duration bursts. They are seen only in radio band. In fact, they were discovered only in 1.4 gigahertz for a long time. And the origin of the fast radio bursts is still not very clear, but now a lot of observational progress has been done. One of the main, in addition to Park's system, is CHIME, which is Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment, which is discovering several fast radio bursts. And then one is observing with ESCAP and other telescopes, and we have been able to localize the fast radio bursts. And now we know that fast radio bursts are extragalactic sources. However, last year we did find one galactic counterpart of this fast radio burst from when we saw a burst from a magnetar system. Initially, it was thought that these are explosive transients because they were not found to be repeating. But now CHIME has discovered some, and other telescopes have discovered some repeating fast radio bursts. So we know that at least in some cases, these are not explosive even. Probably like supernovae and gamma ray, but there are also two channels which produce fast radio bursts. There are more models of fast radio bursts than the number of fast radio bursts. These models include everything from local flare of stars, cosmic strings, um, civilizations in other galaxies, other planets, and in other stellar star systems and whatnot. But I think that currently the models are tilting towards two main ideas. One is that it has to include a very, very high magnetic field. So somehow a magnetar has to be involved. And also another model is that these extremely, for example, during the merger of two very compact objects, one can probably see this millisecond burst of emission. So, but yet it is not clear after this discovery in our galactic field. We know that in at least in some cases, magnetar do give rise to fast radio bursts. Now I'm going to, since we said that this is radio transient, let me just say that there are a lot of, I will just take only a few more minutes, but a lot of surveys are going on all over the world. At GMRT, a group led by Bhashwati Bhattacharya and many other people, they are carrying out the survey of the southern galactic sky mainly for pulsars, but they are discovering other transients also. They are discovering rotating transient. They have discovered some giant bursts from new pulsars. They have discovered some new pulsars. They have also discovered bursts from fast radio bursts, which is a repetitive fast radio bursts. As I told you, some of them do have repetition. So the work is going on at GMRT on this. There are a lot of radio facilities all over the world which are focusing on radio transients. Some of the facilities are upgraded facilities and they are more in tune to search for these radio transients, and I'm just naming some of them here. There are new facilities which are very useful to do transient searches at all radio frequencies, from very low frequencies to very high radio frequencies. And these are various comparisons of sky survey: the sensitivity, the resolution, the sky area coverage, the frequency range, or so on. But one of the things which is important in sky survey is one, of course, what is the sensitivity you can achieve, what kind of sky one can cover, because larger the sky you will cover at a periodic interval, more transients one will be able to search. And also the resolution is important. If you do not have resolution, you won't be able to see the transient on the background of its host galaxy or wherever it is lying. So, and of course the speed of the survey is very critical, because if it is a very slow speed survey, then you will take a very long time to cover the sky. But there are many facilities all over the world which are carrying out survey, and I'm naming some of these telescopes here and their field of view, sensitivity, survey speeds, and all these things. SK is going to be very important. I'm sure you all have heard SK, because this is a radio astronomy winter school, and SK is the next in thing. But just to give you an just brush your memory, there will be SK will be in two phases, SK1 and 2, and hopefully SK1 will be completed in few years from now, and it will have 10% of total collecting area. The final SK will be extremely sensitive and the most sensitive telescope in the world. It will have two sets of telescopes. One will be built in South Africa, which will be, it's called SKA mid, which will be in higher radio frequencies, and then the very low frequencies will be in Australia, which is called SKA low. But I want to say something, that radio astronomy is very important to do transients, but it is an era of multi wavelength and multi messenger astronomy. One is that the baryon matter is only 4% in our universe. Dark matter is 24%. You can't just make best of the telescopes in multi-wave band and try to understand much of the universe. It's not possible. So with the discovery of, say, gravitational waves and neutrinos, we have new messengers to explore the unknowns of our universe. India is not left behind. We have AstroSat, which is a telescope which is working in the range of ultraviolet to gamma rays frequency. It is space-based satellite telescope. We have Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope, GMRT, which is one of the most sensitive low frequency telescope in the world currently. India is a very significant partner in SKA, and so when SKA is completed, India will be on the forefront of radio astronomy, which actually already is, but the progress will be unprecedented. LIGO India is also approved, and within few years, hopefully by 2025 or 2026, we will have a gravitational wave observatory of our own in India, and that is going to contribute very significantly by reducing the sky location of gravitational wave events. So all of these facilities are going to contribute a lot. So I will end by saying that transient universe is really an exciting and fast emerging area within radio astronomy. Radio astronomy is very critical because it doesn't suffer from dust extinction and other kinds of absorptions, which other high frequencies are much more sensitive towards. But eventually, the progress of the field lies in multi-wavelength and multi-messenger information, and that is where the field is headed towards. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
So, I mean, I am learning right now about this. So, will the merging of two neutron stars always result in a black hole, or there could be some other output?
It basically depends upon the masses of neutron stars, but the current understanding is that there is likely to be an intermediate stage which is called supramassive neutron star. But how long will it last is not clear. Maybe it is considered, maybe for low mass neutron star merging, this intermediate state will last longer, and whereas two heavy neutron stars will maybe directly merge to black hole. And this is again theoretical estimate, but the current understanding is that in almost all cases, eventually the merger of two neutron stars will finally become black holes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Also, we know that the most massive black holes are actually in the center of galaxies, right? Those are the quasars and blazars.
Right.
So, is there a chance that any, I mean, we don't know, we're still looking for the origins of the universe, but is there a chance that those uh, small, I mean, those black holes formed by merging one day may become uh, a supermassive black hole and maybe be in the center of a galaxy? I mean, I'm not exactly sure how galaxies are formed, but may this merging actually end up forming a galaxy? Like, I mean, you have some stars and they merge into black holes, and then all of a sudden other celestial bodies may enter in its orbit and somehow form a galaxy or something like that.
So I will say two things on this. One is the expert is sitting right here, Professor Dhruva Saikia, and this is his field of research, so I should not step into that. So I will just say that these supermassive black holes are really supermassive. These are like millions of times of our own stellar mass black holes. So it is very difficult to make these supermassive black holes just by merger of keep on merging these black holes, because that is not that efficient process. But you will not make supermassive black holes by keep on merging these stellar mass black holes. These are two different channels of formation.
Yeah, the black holes in the center of galaxies are really, really, really
Really, yeah.
incredibly huge. I can even imagine.
Exactly. In fact, now, right now, the another controversy is that LIGO is detecting all these black holes which are of the order of few tens of solar masses, whereas we see in our galaxy these X-ray binaries, and these black holes are much small in masses. So how are you making these 30, 40 solar mass black holes is also kind of a challenge to understand.
Yeah, sure. Recently, I was reading to the news about primordial black holes. I had no idea. There's so many stuff on astronomy that actually, when you go deep into it, there's so many stuff yet to learn. But I just
Yeah.
learned that this theory about primordial black holes, and actually, some people are thinking there is one in our solar system, and I'm like, oh my god, this is so new, like a black hole the size of a ball, like you know so small, but way more massive than our sun.
That is true, and primordial black holes are not yet proven, but yes, of course, their existence has been talked out for a long time, and now people are hoping that maybe with the gravitational waves and this another messenger, maybe one can able to find out their existence in like once for all, rather than just having to rely on the theories.
Yeah, I think it would be challenging to do so. I mean, as far as I've read, we can only assume there is one, by looking into the bodies around it. Because as far I'm not sure. You can correct. Like it's a question actually. If primordial black holes will be able to send some emission strong enough to be detected.
No. You won't be able to detect them like that. And if you are going for primordial black holes, you will not be able to detect gravitational waves from that far away from these direct channels. But there could be other circumstantial evidences which can come from these primordial black holes, which I'm really not that well aware of. But cosmologists will probably know more than I know about those.
Yeah, but thank you very much.
Sure.
I think this is amazing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, can you like initially you mentioned about the magnetic massive stars. Can you like tell some properties and like how can we identify those?
Yeah, so the actually magnetic massive stars itself have been a mystery in stellar astronomy, because these stars are so massive that they are expected to have radiative outermost layer, and in radiative layer one is not supposed to have magnetic field, because in sun you have these convective layers and you create this dynamo effect and you produce this magnetic field. But it has been seen that 10% of the magnetic massive stars in the galaxy host these kilogauss scales magnetic fields, which are dipolar magnetic fields, very simple magnetic field geometries. And these are right now thought to be probably coming from the just the ISM. So these are basically the relic magnetic field of the ISM, or just coming from that. And it has been seen that if you have these simple magnetic geometries, one if one studies them in radio band, then one can see an emission which is called gyrosynchrotron emission, again roughly the same principle as is coming from another synchrotron emission. And since the magnetic field is dipolar, the magnetic field will be this variable geometry, and one can also see this radio emission varying, and this has been seen in some magnetic stars. But another very interesting aspect is that in 2000 there was one star, magnetic massive star, from which electron cyclotron major emission was seen. And then for 18 years the field was just stagnant, and there was that, because that was the only star. But then in 2018 with GMRT, we like a student Bernali Das, she found a second star which was showing this electron cyclotron major emission. And after that we started a survey of these magnetic massive stars, and we pointed the telescope towards around 30 such stars, or actually slightly less than that. And we have now by now discovered around seven new stars which are showing these electron cyclotron major emission. And these are order of magnitude larger emission. They will be completely nearly 100% circularly polarized emission, and they will be coming only at, in one full rotation only twice. You will see this little flash of light, and then that's that, then it is gone. So right now the understanding of this field is not yet very evolved, because these are a very new phenomena and people are still trying to understand them. But this is really an exciting field of research currently.
Can this be one of the resources for magnetic field that we get from stars, like from
One
this
of the
cluster of stars? Like whenever, like consider a cluster of stars,
yes.
and there are few points wherein we can see the this magnetic field and the synchrotron emission in a circular way, like its contour is in circular shape.
No,
So
these will not contribute to the cluster, or as because these are very much associated with the star, and as you go further away from a star, you will not have magnetic field. They will be just associated with the stars. But the ISM, the clusters, they will have their own small amount of magnetic field. So,
okay.
but these individual stars are not going to contribute. In fact, the understanding is that these individual stars are stealing the magnetic field from these surrounding medium. Means these are these relic ISM leftover magnetic field which was in the ISM when this star was formed. It took that magnetic field, and now that is why you are seeing some of these stars magnetic. But then this is, again, as I said, it's a very new field of research, and only people are still trying to understand. And in 2019 there was a Nature paper where they said that they showed the simulation that merger of two normal stars can also make a magnetic massive star. So there are these ideas which are floating around in the field, and it is not really that clear, what exactly is happening.
How fast are they seen rotating?
Oh, these are generally so they range from, say, so the fastest one is around, say, half a day or so. But then we also see which are rotating of the order of several days or 2 weeks also. I would say that we are a little biased towards the fast rotators because it's much easier to plan the observations and look for these ECME signatures. So we are generally limiting ourselves to whatever is rotating faster than say 3 days or so. So, but of course but they're relatively fast rotators than a non-massive star. I'm sorry, non-magnetic massive star.
So the pulse widths are, of the order of what, an hour or something.
Yes, you could say so. These pulse widths, if you're looking for gyrosynchrotron, then that is modulated and that will be according to the rotation period. But if you're looking for this coherent emission, then this is like hour, 2 hours, or something like that. There will be a little width also, so maybe I would say 2-3 hours is still okay, but yeah, not more than that.
So polarization must have rich information.
Oh, it does, and it's very, in fact, simple to do that because these are only circularly polarized, and GMRT low frequency feeds are circular feeds. So you just have to make observation in the two polarization channels and just find the difference of the two, and they are close to 90, 95, 100% polarized. So yeah, and that has all the information. We haven't found,
Linear.
no, they are circularly polarized. We don't see the linear polarization from them.
Ma'am, then while observing, if we have to classify between pulsar and a magnetic massive star, then is it only the time period on which we can classify differentiate them, or will there be any other criteria?
Pulsar is a rotating neutron star,
Yeah, ma'am.
and magnetic massive star is a main sequence star.
No,
So
ma'am.
they
While
are very two
observation,
different parts of stellar, you would say evolution stage. So it's you can imagine, since neutron star is only a very small star, say 10 kilometer in size, it is going to rotate very, very fast, and everything is happening at a very fast scale. The magnetic field is very high. The magnetic field in
okay.
these pulsars are of the order of 10 to the power 12 Gauss or so. These magnetic massive stars, the main sequence stars, are of the order of kilo Gauss or something like that. So they are a very different stages of stellar evolution.
Okay, so amplitude and period can be what we can classify them, right? On the basis of it.
You can, yes, that you can do that, but I think a bigger elephant is the stage of the evolution here.
Thank you, ma'am.
But yes, you are right. Amplitude and period also will change for the two sets.
Ma'am, like I have a small doubt regarding that neutron star merger.
Yeah.
Ma'am, like you have mentioned that first we saw that event using gravitational waves, and after a few days, like we saw that same event using X-rays and radio wave spectrum. Like, what is the actual reason for that time delay, ma'am?
So in this case, it's actually a very interesting question. And when one does a full modeling, and after a long time, when one understood the system, it turned out that when these two neutron stars merged, and this radiation came out, and if you remember, this radiation is collimated, uh, so the radiation was not looking towards us. As per current understanding, this radiation was around 20 degrees away from us. So basically we did not see the radio and X-ray emission because it was pointed somewhere else. But since it was only 20 degrees away, and this ejecta will slow down with time, which means it means the Lorentz factor will decrease with time, which means the theta, which is 1 over Lorentz factor, will keep on increasing. Eventually, at some point, it did come in our line of sight, but you could still see it in optical band, because optical is not coming from this jet. Optical is coming from something called kilonova, which is a more spherical part of the thing, which is coming due to the radioactive decay. So that's why optical were observed within 10 hours or so, but radio and X-ray, which is coming from just jet interacting with the surrounding medium, this we started to see only when it came to our line of sight.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Sure.
So, can I ask a small related question?
Sure.
So the profile of increase of intensity at a given frequency, or in radio in particular, should trace a theoretical profile of the beam pattern, appropriately accounting for the increasing beam width or decrease in the Lorentz factor.
Yes.
But the profile should trace this evolution and the theoretical beam pattern of radiating particles.
So the profile does that, and as I showed you here, let me just go to that plot. So this is a synchrotron in 3D. So at what time you are observing at what frequencies, the profile does give you the information. In fact, and this is how we get to know the information. But in fact, another critical information is that if you are doing the VLBI, you can even look at this actual jet, the width of this beam, and then if you do the VLBA observation within, say, 2-3 times, then you can see the how fast is this expanding, and that also gives you the more, actually that gives you a very straight away information independent of for all modeling also about this expansion speed or so. There is in fact a third way to do that, and the third way is that initially these events are very very small, to the extent that you will probably undergo scintillation since they are so far away, and so you measure
Right.
at very fast quick intervals, and then you will see the scintillation, and then at some point when it has become big enough that you will stop seeing the scintillation, and that can also give you some estimation on the size of the fireball and how fast it is expanding. In fact, there are 2-3 GRBs for this, such rich data exist, and there is a paper in fact by us in 2008 for a GRB 070125, where from scintillation we estimated the size of this system. So there are these different ways one can do it, but as you can see in all of these, radio really turns out to be one of the important factor.
What
Excuse
decides
me.
the direction of GRB?
Sorry, can you repeat please?
What decides the direction of GRB? Like,
What decides the direction of GRB? That will depend upon, what is the rotation axis of the two neutron stars they are merging, when they were merging, or when this big star which is collapsing, what is I think rotation axis is probably the most important factor, and which is a random in the sky, we don't know with
All
respect to our
the
line of
orbital
sight.
axis,
Sorry.
all the axis of the orbit.
uh, so okay, you are right in that sense, that when and after that, when the black hole will be formed, then the accretion disk will be formed, and then how this this orbit, this accretion disk around this, and the perpendicular to that, along that direction the matter will be ejected. But if you are having the two neutron star merging together, how those stars are rotating will eventually determine how this axis of orbit will be aligned. So they're all connected. But yes, eventually, Avi is correct that, Desh is correct that you will have to eventually, then finally, how the accretion disk forms, and then, the perpendicular to that accretion disk, the matter will be ejected along that direction. But we really have no control over that. It is different for different stars, and we just will happen to see what comes to our line of sight.